I'm Caitlin and welcome to the Lit Review. Today we are doing my February wrap-up with stats. So I have a mid-month wrap-up system on this channel, so you will have already seen these books plus Love Only Once by Joanna Lindsay already in my February mid-month wrap-up, which I will link for you above and below. So I will be including the stats for these books in this wrap-up, and will only mention them as needed, but for the full reviews, please go check out that video. As always, I have a two-box system here on this channel. It's how I decide whether or not the books I read are staying, going, or ooh, I'm just not sure. So I will let you know at the end or somewhere in the review for each of the books that I've read this month, whether they're being kept, whether they are going in my no box, which means they will be getting out of my house as soon as that box fills up, or I also have like a maybe box where the books that I just need like some time and space, but I don't want them on my shelves taking up time and space. I will be making decisions on both of those boxes as they fill up, and my goodness, they are getting so full. I say that like every month, but I'm literally just trying to wait until I can next do a book haul on this channel, because I have a system where if I hit a new book haul but haven't read the amount of books that I hauled last, I have to unhaul the number that remains. So I'm trying to protect that a little bit by having books that I can unhaul that are already prepped to unhaul. So that's why you keep hearing me saying that. So what I'll be doing in this video is I will spend the first half of it going over the stats for the whole month. And I've really broadened what stats mean this year on my channel. So there's going to be a lot. I will leave timestamps below if you would like to skip through any of that. I will also leave timestamps with content warnings for each of the books I will be discussing. And if a content warning is very spoilery, I will be mentioning that in the box below, so beware of spoilers. We do have 4 books for me to talk about in review today, so I will also be doing that as well. But let's get to those stats first. So in terms of books read, I read 7 books, but I'll be talking about 8 because I DNF'd a book that I read like a significant chunk of. So you'll be hearing about that book as well. I read 2,724 pages, which is like a little bit more than last month. I did not listen to any audiobooks, so no hours listened. And my average rating was 3.92, which is the highest it's been in a hot minute. So that's pretty nice. In terms of my audience segments, I read predominantly adult books with 5 books that were intended for an adult audience. No new adult or middle grade or anything like that this month, but 2 YA picks did make an appearance. I only had 2 significant genres come up this month. Everything else was just like little one-offs, but I did read more fantasy and contemporary books this month than anything else. And I always like to talk about format and how much I owned versus how much I borrowed. So format, again, no audiobooks, 1 ebook, and then 7 physical, and that figure also includes my DNF. Of those books, 7 of them were owned and only 1 was borrowed from the library. And then part of the new stats that I like to bring to you is more like discussion-oriented stuff before I get into ratings. And so one of the things I like to talk about is how the author uses pronouns. So I read 3 books by male authors who are using he, him pronouns. I read 4 books from female authors using she, her pronouns, and 1 book by a non-binary author who uses they, them pronouns. So that's where my little ID breakdown netted out in February. Then this month for authors' identification of racial identity, we have 5 white authors, 1 Latinx, 1 Asian, and 1 Black author for each of those identity groups. I also like to do a thing where I tell you about the like ratios of representation in what I'm reading and like what that looks like for both main characters and supporting characters. Not as diverse this month, unfortunately. The top form of representation was in having main characters who were people of color. So 4 out of the 8 books that I read had at least 1 main character that was POC or BIPOC. Then the second most, which was a little in comparison, is where the protagonist or one of the main characters was a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. So 2 out of the 8 books I read had a main character who was part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And then in comparison, supporting characters did not fare very well this month. The only really notable thing I think is that we have like one of the 8 books had a prominent supporting character that was a person of color or a BIPOC individual. So it was not as good of a month for diversity, and I don't like that. So I'm gonna work on that next month. I also like to talk to you in really broad strokes about some of the trigger warnings that you might be hearing about when I discuss these books. Some of them have already come to pass, and those will already have been mentioned in my mid-month review down in the description box. When I do mid-month reviews, that's where you're going to find those. So the first one, I'm not going to tell you which book because it's very spoilery, but the biggest trigger warning, and I do rank these in terms of impact or potential to harm, the biggest trigger warning is child abuse. That only happened in one book. And I will list that down below if you would like to know the spoilers of that, but I will not be naming that here. The other one that appeared in at least 2, I think you can make a case for 3 books, is loss of a loved one, and certain books had a much stronger theme of that than others. Several of them are ones that I will be talking about today, so I don't think they're terribly spoilery. So I'm going to call those out when I talk about them. And then it's more minor but worth discussing. I don't think I talked about it as much in my mid-month, but I just want to call it out, is that the third lowest trigger warning but still relevant is actually when I read A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. There's a lot of PTSD and processing of trauma in this book. So that is definitely a factor. It's not, I think, something that would hinder the average person's enjoyment, but it is present. So I wanted to shout that out in the stats wrap up. But those were the major trigger or content warnings for this month. And I like to ask a question at the end of my stats because I am constantly looking for recommendations to improve some of the things that I'm feeling like just aren't as present. And there's a lot I can improve on. So my question for you is, what's some of your favorite or best disability rep? And that's a really broad umbrella term, so feel free to utilize or clarify to a degree that you're comfortable with. But I would really like to be able to read some more own voices disability rep, or at the very least, disability rep that the community it represents feels strongly about. So let me know down in the comments below if you have any recommendations for me about that topic or category. I would love to hear from you. Y'all have given me some really solid recommendations that I'm hoping to chase down throughout the year and through many years of my reading habits, because you'll give me so many great recommendations. I can't read them all this year, but I do keep track of them, and I hope to be able to bring them to you at some point. So I have 4 books to talk to you about, including 1 DNF. But before I do that, let's do a quick ratings breakdown. So I had 1 DNF, 1 5-star rating, 1 4.5 star rating, 2 4-star ratings, 2 3.5-star ratings, and 1 3-star rating, and everything else is just not there, so we won't talk about it. But it was a really good reading month. Like I said, my average rating was 3.9 something, and that's pretty high for me on this channel. So let's get into those last 4 books that helped me get to these high numbers. The first book I read in the last half of February is The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. Realistically, I was reading this almost all month long. I kept taking other breaks to read other books to try to get through this lovely thick tome. I think Brandon Sanderson does a great job of having a moderate pace throughout until he hits what I have heard called many times the Sanderlanche, where the last chunk-a-dunk of this book just gets so good that you don't want to put it down. So I think that holds true with The Well of Ascension. I gave this book 4.5 stars, and I think what ultimately keeps it within that realm is I really liked Mistborn so much more, just that little half-star more. So I still think this is a really fantastic read, and I'm very much a fan of this series, but I do think Mistborn was just a wee bit better. So that's why it gets a 4.5-star rating. I will definitely be keeping these, in part because this is technically Jeremy's book. I just borrowed it, but it will be staying in our household because that's one of his favorite authors, and I totally get why. I do think it's a really good continuation from book 1, so let me talk to you a little bit about what happens in book 1. One of our main characters here is Vin, who is a 16 to 17-year-old girl who grew up on the streets meets and discovers by joining this crew that she is a Mistborn, and that means that she is an Allomancer, and Allomancers in this world can digest metal to do really cool and weird magical stuff. So that's a very rare ability, and it's part of like a hidden class system, because typically this is something that only nobles can do. So she gets involved with another Mistborn named Kelsier and joins his crew to like take down the final empire, this big bad evil emperor who's been reigning for hundreds of years. So this is book 2, which takes place after the events of book 1 and continues their complicated journey, this crew and predominantly Vin's, to get to understand like more of the myths and mysticism that establish the final empire and try to like defeat some of those foes that are of old. That's as much of a synopsis as I will try to give you for Wall of Ascension, because I feel like saying anything else gets really spoilery for book 1, and I don't want to do that to you. But I still really enjoyed this. There's a smidgen, like we're talking like a Salt Bay sprinkle of romance in here. Sanderson does not go deep on his romance, but as a romance reader, I will hunt and find that romance anywhere in that story, and I will enjoy it. So that is definitely not the only thing worth doing in here. I do think it's a really good plot-driven, multiple perspective book. What I love about Sanderson's writing style is that I am a person who likes to puzzle stuff out, who likes to hypothesize and make conjectures and like try to figure things out. Often I am very wrong, and I enjoy being wrong when the writing is good. And so he makes me really puzzle stuff out. And then when stuff gets revealed, I'm always like, oh, I didn't see that coming, or I saw part of that coming, but I didn't see this twist. And so I think he's a really mentally engaging writer in that way. So if you find yourself really liking that kind of plot and story, please check out Brandon Sanderson. Like, I highly recommend that for that plot twisty fantasy space. And Mistborn is a really good thing to start with in particular, because even though this is still a lovely thick tome at like 700, almost 800 pages, these are definitely some of his shorter books. So start with that and see how you fare. But highly recommend, definitely going to read the third book in this series. All right, and now we're going to talk about my DNF, because I gave this book a lot of chances. I got just under 150 pages of Crosstalk by Connie Willis before I could not take it anymore. I usually have a rule where I have to read at least 50 pages of a book before I will allow myself to DNF it, because some people are not good with beginnings. And if I can get past or at least through a chunk of the first act, I feel like I've given something a good chance. I gave this multiple chances. I have never read any Connie Willis before. She is a really well-respected sci-fi writer. She's won a Nebula and a Hugo Award, so clearly there's other things that people really adore and respect about her writing. This book was just not for me, and here's why. I will give you the synopsis, and then I'm going to go into why this was just not a thing for me. So the synopsis is what initially drew me in. So our main character's name is Bridie, and she works in a telecommunications company in a future that's not too far off from our own. Significantly though, what's more pronounced in this is the way that gossip infiltrates spaces, and how quickly and how toxic that kind of close communication can be. So it really plays up that obsession that we do have in our timeline with our communication devices, our phones in particular. In this world, the new hotness, the new rage is for people to get this neural surgery that links romantic partners. You have to go through a whole barrage of tests and stuff, and it's intended to create a neural link where you can feel one another's emotions. But Bridie and her boyfriend of several months decide to go through with this surgery because they want to feel closer. And her boyfriend says, I want to do this before we get married so that we're sure. Stuff sus to begin with. But what ends up happening is they go through with the surgery, and Bridie wakes up and she hears somebody else's voice in her head. This neural link, you're not even supposed to hear people's voices, you're just supposed to get their feelings. But she hears somebody else's voice in her head And so she's desperately trying to figure out how that happened and if she can hide it from her boyfriend. I can only speak to like the roughly 150 pages that I read of this, but what pushed me out of this book was actually the characters. I have mentioned many times before that I consider myself a character-driven reader. I love a good plot and an intricate plot. Obviously, Sanderson does that really, really well. But I am a sucker for character development. And I didn't like a single fucking character in this book. Excuse my language, but like they were terrible. Bridie is so obnoxious to me. Like she just doesn't see what's right in front of her face. It's really obvious from a plot perspective that her boyfriend is suspect as all get out. Like he keeps, like the author's not even really trying to hide it. It's just, I can tell you without having read this book that her boyfriend doesn't actually want a neural link with her for any other reason than for his own gain in business. I'm not entirely sure how that rolls out, but you can just tell that he doesn't give a damn about her, and everybody else can see it and she can't, which is fine as a story point. It was so obvious and she was just so dense about it. The other people in her life just feel like really, really intense caricatures of human beings in a way that was not pleasant. I get the sense that this was like an attempt at a low grade level of satire with that caricature, and it just didn't land for me personally. For instance, her family is so overbearing, and it just like, you read each and every one of those characters and you're like, that ain't real. Like that, no, that cannot be. This is like a cartoon of a human being. And I come from a family of overbearing personalities. Like, and I'm saying that, like, I just did not like the characters in this at all. And then within that 150 pages, now granted, this is a book that is about 500 pages, like just a smidgen under. And I read 150 pages worth and I felt like we had barely kicked off the plot. We had just barely kicked it off. And so I just didn't want to go through reading the rest of it, and I DNF'd it. So in terms of what this means for like my game, my Litland TBR, I can totally DNF something, and as long as I read a book that like fits the same general prompts, we're all good. So what I did to make that work is I swapped out this, which was originally a fantasy or sci-fi prompt in Litland, with Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, which was y'all's collective pick for Buzzwordathon in February. And so this is a fantasy. Crosstalk is a sci-fi. I think it goes without saying that I will be putting Crosstalk in the no box. But now let's switch gears to talking about Gods of Jade and Shadow. This is my second book that I have read from Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. So it's important that this is my second book from Silvia Moreno-Garcia because I think I fell into that readerly trap of loving one book that I read from an author, and then somehow the second book I read kind of suffered a little bit in comparison. So take my rating with a grain of salt. I really loved Mexican Gothic. I still think this is a heckin' great book, and I really loved the mythology on this, so I do still recommend it. However, I think this will be going in my maybe box because I need some distance to figure out whether or not I'd like to reread it or whether or not it just needs to find a new appreciative home. Let's talk a little bit about this book. So it is a lush historical fantasy. I am coming to expect that from Silvia Moreno-Garcia and its own voices for her culture and the Latinx community. Particularly, she writes really amazing stories set in Mexico, and this is no exception. So our main character is, I believe she's like 17 or 18. Her name is Cassiopeia Tun. This is one of the books that has a little bit of that loss of a loved one, but it doesn't weigh heavily on the story. She just thinks about her father who, when we first meet her, has been gone for several years. So she and her mom move back in to her mother's family home, and she has a really complicated relationship with the rest of her family. And by complicated, I mean it's abusive and not good. They treat her very much like a servant, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that while her mother's side of the family is kind of big fish in a little pond in a small town in Mexico, her father has like more native Indian heritage. Although the exact heritage is not super strongly identified. It's just described like that her skin tone is darker. Like other characters sometimes in passing refer to her native heritage in a really derogatory way. So it's very like a subtle undercurrent. So there is a bit of like that colorism discussion within this book as an undercurrent and something that affects Cassiopeia's life. So she has to take care of her grandfather. She does a lot of like chores around the house, and all she dreams of is just escaping and going to see the world. And one day she does something she's not supposed to do. She opens her grandfather's chest that he always has the key around his neck. But one day he accidentally, like, he leaves it behind, and Cassiopeia opens the chest. And that opens a whole crazy adventure that she goes on for the rest of the book, because in that chest were the bones of a death god. And I won't say too much more from that because I think there's some spoilers there. But she has to then go on a quest with that death god to like basically retain or regain his godhood and fight his brother that put him in that chest. Like if you want like a road trip, a historical fantasy road trip book, may I recommend this to you, because that is exactly what this is. There is a whole bunch of adventures and like quests, and it very much feels in some respects like a video game, because there are different like bosses essentially that they have to fight. And it really is about that journey and like the character introspection for both Cassiopeia and the god that she is with. So it was really cool, really good cultural stuff. I really love Moreno-Garcia's writing for that. Like I think she just ties in culture with really cool plots in ways that I don't see very commonly. And so I'm becoming an increasing fan of Silvia Moreno-Garcia as a writer. As I'm talking about it, I am talking myself into keeping it, because the way I talk about this book is definitely not a maybe. The way I talk about this book is a yes. So I think it just changed my mind from maybe to yes. So I guess I'll be keeping this because as I'm talking about it, I'm really realizing how many amazing story elements were present in this that I just thought were expertly well crafted. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm all about as a reader. I'm in there for the emotional content too, but I'm also just in there for the craft of writing. And I think if anything, this maybe didn't hit as hard on the emotional side, which is where my biases often lie, but from a just pure craft and just intelligence and creativity, Silvia Moreno-Garcia like constantly knocks it out of the park in those very important ways for me. So I do think this is maybe more important than I initially led myself and you to believe now that I'm talking about it out loud, which is why I do this, which is honestly why this is very helpful for me, because it gives me a space to chat and figure it all out. But yeah, also I talk about covers a lot, but I think this is one of the most like gorgeous, evocative covers. I have been consistently impressed with the graphic designers that are working with Silvia Moreno-Garcia. They really help create specific visions and times and places, because all of her books have very specific time periods, or at least all of the books I've read from her so far. Whew. Okay. And then the last book that I will talk to you about is my small book for the last little chunk of the month. And that is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. So it's a really small little book that actually is not an anthology, but it's told in like these 4 tales that are interwoven and connected. And each of those stories have many of the same characters, but like you're just getting a different perspective or a different focal point. And it all takes place in this cafe that's in like a basement and has been there for decades and decades, where with a very specific set of rules, you can travel into the past briefly, as long as you don't leave the cafe and as long as you finish your drink before the coffee gets cold. There are other rules, but those are the really big ones, is you can't leave the cafe and you gotta finish your drink. I also gave this a 3.5 star rating, even though it was a really emotionally impactful read. For me, it just, why it didn't get 4 stars, as I felt like a little bogged down in some of the repetition that I think was inherent to the story because of the way the stories interweave. And I think there was definitely craft and intent and power behind that repetition, but it just wasn't for me. I am not somebody that likes a great deal of repetition in my reading experiences. So that's more of like my personal bias as a reader, but like in terms of recommending this book to other people, I think there's so much fascinating stuff going on here, and I highly recommend this book. I know that phrase highly recommend gets overused a lot, because I think, you know, you should lowly recommend or moderately recommend some stuff too. But I do think that this, if you are a reader who's really thoughtful, who really likes a meditation on character, who likes emotional depth and like backstory and to peel back layers of characters as they go, this book is going to hit all the right notes for you. I am usually that kind of person, but I think the repetition like knocked me out of my space a little bit there. But it's really just sweet and thoughtful and tender and emotional, and it'll hurt a little bit too, because there is, again, loss of a loved one is one of the content warnings. It will be an emotional experience for some based on that content. But I, as somebody who has lost a loved one, did not find it harmful or exploitative. It just might trip some triggers for you is all. So know that going in, but it's a really lovely book. I know there is not quite a sequel, but like another book that kind of continues to tell tales from the cafe. I think it might even be called Tales from the Cafe. Yeah, I don't know if I will read the second one. I feel like this is such a beautiful standalone, honestly. You could read the other supplemental book and probably get a lot out of it, knowing these characters and knowing the place. But I thought it was just such a lovely standalone book. I do think this will be going in the maybe box for me. And why I want to put it there is, as impactful as this reading experience was on me, I'm not sure I want to reread it. I feel like it's one of those books that I want to honor and treasure my first memory of it and don't necessarily need to re-engage or reread it, which means that I could happily pass this on to somebody else, or like have it find its way to like a little lending library or something. Because I think this book needs to journey further out into the rest of the world, if that makes sense. I'm not even sure if that makes sense, but that's kind of where my head's at with it. So these are the 4 books I read, or in one case didn't read fully, for the last half of February. I know I've been talking a lot at you. My voice is very gravelly now that I've been talking for so long. Let me know down in the comments again if you have any recommendations for me about books with disability rep or own voices authors for disability reads. I would love to hear from you. And let me know if you've read any of these books or had different feelings. Just because I have really strong opinions about a book doesn't mean yours are not still welcome or valid. So, you know, just let me know what you thought down in the comments below. In the meantime, thank you for spending time with me. I hope you have a fantastic reading day. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of me or this channel, and I'll see you in the next one.